this month we're lucky to have not one but two authors with us, so I haven't done that in a while. So I'm delighted to welcome Colm Keys and Dermot Reilly to the book club. Thank you both very much for joining us. I know it's a particularly busy time of the year for GAA journalists. Dermot, you're not getting a break, or Colm, you're not getting a break at the moment at all. So thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you
And
for having
they're
us, Julianne.
delighted. And your book, it's I don't even know where to start. It's astonishing the amount of information in this book. I've learned so much, not only about the players and the finals and the contest, but also it's a real social history, I think, of Ireland. So Chasing Sam Maguire is the book, and it's the first 50 years of Sam and the teams he played in the finals. Dermot, I might start with you, if that's okay. So from the introduction and forward in the book, I can see you had a successful career, you retired, and instead of jetting off into the sunset, you decided to take on this absolutely mammoth project. I suppose the first question has to be why?
I suppose a lifelong curiosity and interest in the game and in the history of the games and the GAA. But, you know, as somebody who would routinely read every GAA book and record that ever came out, I was always struck by the fact that when you look back into history and you see a reference to somebody playing back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, very often you'd be seeing somebody's name, but only with an initial and no real idea of where the man, and it was always a man in the context of football and hurling, where he was from, and you had nothing more about it. So I just thought it would be an interesting exercise to see how difficult it would be to establish for everybody whoever lined out on All Ireland Day or appeared on All Ireland Day, whether as a player or a sub for either team, because it is a big achievement. It's a big occasion in any sportsman's life. And to see, well, can we put a little bit more in terms of meat on the bones to find out the person's name, their club, if they have a nickname. And I'd start doodling with this thing many, many years ago. And I suppose Colm can take it from here, but he and I would have had some discussion, and I put a challenge to him. How long would it take us? And maybe Colm, you can take it from there to fill in the gaps.
Well, that was it, Dermot. Initially, we were looking around for the clubs of the players involved in All Ireland finals, and that was the premise of all of this at the outset. We did not really plan in any way to go beyond that, because I would have thought it was exhaustive enough to try and track that anyway, but I never realized how much and how exhaustive, because really trying to establish the clubs of players, you would think, you know, you look back at the last 50 years and the programs are always going to contain that, and that information is ready there now. But you go back the years and it is really, really difficult, because players moved from club to club and county to county in the 20s, 30s, 40s, right into the 50s, and even for a section into the 60s. Movement was easy and there was so much more migration then. So actually establishing the club of the players was difficult, and that was first base for us. But over time then, as we got into it and realized there was a lot more, when you're researching and you're looking back and you're trying to track the players, you start to read so much more and research so much more, and you say, that's interesting, or this is interesting, and that's worth bringing to light. So we gathered and mined all this information over time and harvested it really, and then came up with the idea. I think Dermot initially was we would do a piece or a passage of text about each final to accompany the teams at that stage. Exactly. And Dermot probably came up with the idea, and at the outset was always fascinated with a social history or a number of bullet points as we have laid them out. That was very much something he wanted to pursue as well. And as it turned out, it's a fantastic addition, I think, and many people would have commented to me about that it just sets a context for the year that was, and in which each All Ireland final was played. And it's a social history, a short, very short social history of Ireland. And we also attached just various points about the All Ireland finals themselves as well. And after that, then we added, and this was the really mammoth task, I think, above everything, was just to build up to the championship itself in a particular year. So we started to add all the events and all the runs of play and how teams arrived at finals as well. So the background to that year, and that was really an exhaustive. So to put 50 years together, and you might say, why 50 years? Well, the first Sam Maguire seemed a very, very good starting point.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, Dermot, and it's probably you'd agree with me, it was around 1928 and into the 30s where actually media coverage, you can see that started to improve. Certainly in the 30s, it got better and better. Into the 40s, improved. I think the biggest leap of all for media coverage of Gaelic games to me was late 40s, 1950s. It really came into its own and has obviously developed since then. So we were able to track it better in the years of Sam Maguire. I think if you were to go back before that and continue the exercise, it would be really, really difficult to get that information. So that's how we arrived at it. If it was planning permission, I think we'd have been hauled before on board Planola a long time ago, Dermot. We added so many bits and pieces on the run. We never set out to finish with what we had. We just added an extension here and there, and we eventually came up with what we have.
And even then to get it, I suppose O'Brien or the publishers, like I know they're wary to publish sometimes, any publisher, like a huge big book like this. So was that a challenge then once you had the information? How did you go about turning it into a book?
Well, we spoke with a number of publishers, it's fair to say, and we received some very positive feedback. We received no feedback in some instances, but I suppose at this juncture, it's only fair to acknowledge that, while we had enthusiasm, there was nobody more enthusiastic than the late Michael O'Brien from O'Brien Press, because I had sent him a sample from our book, and he was on very quickly. We met, and to be very fair, and he's been a great supporter of Irish writing over decades, and he died within weeks, unfortunately, of us finally having signed up with him. But while there were plenty of challenges in our discussions with Michael and indeed his successors in the business, his enthusiasm and his immediate recognition, as he said to himself, as he said to us, I'm not a GAA person, but I can see the social and cultural importance of this project, because nothing had ever been done like it before. And I suppose he was particularly attracted to the social dimension that we had added. That wasn't part of the original brief, but it became irresistible when you're reading old newspapers and checking old records, and you open the front page of All Ireland Day to look at what the build-up to the match might be, and then you see some of the news lines about Adolf Hitler or Eamon de Valera or whatever it might be. It just became irresistible. So the long answer to your question, Julianne, is that once we had the backing and the support of Michael O'Brien, and there were others who were similarly enthusiastic, but he really, really bought into it big time.
Brilliant. I agree about the social history piece. That really struck me because I wasn't expecting that when I would see a lot of GAA books. So I think it brought it alive. It was a backdrop, and it was lovely to have Irish kind of moments and international ones and light-hearted ones. I like the references to cinema. The Wizard of Oz that year. You mentioned that, Casablanca. And what I loved were the ads in the national newspapers, and I thought they were so funny. There was one about a face cream, and basically the woman telling us that she has gotten a husband because she used this face cream. So it really puts, I suppose, the era. It puts you in a place. And the descriptions from some of the local newspapers were brilliant. I'm totally biased as well, the local newspaper. So very, really interesting. I loved it. It's, as I said, it's quite difficult to know where to start nearly with the questions. So what I did was I picked out a couple of matches, I suppose, that I thought were maybe significant significant to ask you about, and some, I suppose, some incidents, and then you might have some yourselves that you both kind of maybe think are worth mentioning. But before that, I'd like to just ask one more thing about the process, and it's, I suppose, the imagery and how you source them, because some of the images are fantastic, particularly the players and the stadiums, and the celebrations as well with the crowds and the cup. Was that a difficult process to trace them or track them down?
It was like tracking the teams. I think it was very exhaustive process. Dermot very much led on that. He was down to the National Library very quickly and built up a strong rapport with the staff there, and was able to get in and procure a lot of them, and obviously sports file for the more modern, for the more recent photographs as well. And we were able to pick them up off the Western people. We were able to pick them up off George Cartwright, who's a very well renowned author himself.
Yeah, we've had him on the book club as well.
In Cavan GAA circles. George, of course, was very helpful. And Dermot established a number of contacts, which I think he'd be able to go through as well. Gaelic art was one of them, and they were very helpful in the end too, Dermot, with some of the images that we sourced from them.
Yeah, Gaelic art were very helpful. You know, Croke Park has its own repository in Croke Park, and we went through that. A number of, direct links. There were people, there's a man here in Dublin called Jimmy Wren, and he was able to give
I saw his name on a few of them,
And they were absolutely not available elsewhere. Colm Henley, man well into his 90s, great Roscommon man, similarly a great help. Colm mentioned the National Library there, and it would be fair to point out or to highlight the contribution of one Barbara Bonini, an Italian lady, because when I went in to explain what we wanted to do, she wanted to know who Sam Maguire was. But I can tell you, before the project was finished, she put as much effort into it as we did, and she was so enthusiastic. And we'd lots of support everywhere. It wasn't easy. A lot of the challenge was we may have had photographs on occasions, but we didn't necessarily have a description of what
who
was
they
in
were. Yeah.
But it was good fun. It was a labor of love in every sense of the word. There were frustrations, but every time you'd achieve in terms of identifying a player, a player's club, a photograph, a little victory like that was something that kept up the enthusiasm.
Funny, when we were chatting actually about the book in the office yesterday, and the first thing I've written down is a labour of love. One of my colleagues actually said that line, and it really comes across, I think, in the book, because the detail is unbelievable, and I wasn't expecting a championship kind of summation as well as the final. I thought it would be just the final. So it's huge amounts of research, and the amount of counties involved, it's amazing. I suppose before I pick my matches that stood out, Colm, I might ask you, have you a couple, I suppose, of key years that you think are particularly of interest?
Well, I led off on the preface with the story of the Maguire brothers from Cavan in 1952, because I think it's hugely significant in terms of obviously everything is rooted to county and to place, but on that occasion, I won't say they walked out of different houses because we don't know where they came from, but two brothers, Tom and Liam, they all were originally from Cornafane in Cavan, where actually George Cartwright is from. We mentioned him earlier. But they moved to Oldcastle sometime before 1952. And while they joined Oldcastle, the club, Tom and Liam continued to play for Cavan. But Brendan, their younger brother, and I think he was still eligible for minor at the time when he was going to Gormanstown College within Meath, he ended up playing with Meath, and he was midfield that day in opposition to his two brothers in an All-Ireland final. So I felt, in putting the preface together, that is one of the most unusual All-Ireland final stories I think you will ever get. Maybe even the most in terms of that siblings would be on different sides on an All-Ireland final day. You have to think back. Who were the family supporting? They were living in Oldcastle, but originally from Cavan. So I always would have, and there's such a rivalry, and there was at that time such a rivalry between Meath and Cavan, and Oldcastle is very close to
Border.
to the Cavan border in Meath, and it's even to this day, and neither team are as strong as they were, but that rivalry still burns deep, and you can just imagine that. So there's always a fascination with that story. Apart from that, I mean, what we try to do is bring alive just various stories. Everybody knows the significance of Down being the first county from the 6 counties to win an All Ireland title in 1960. And everybody will, the first Sam Maguire in Kildare in 1928, that will always resonate to some of those bigger moments for sure. But we try to bring alive other stories as well, just to accompany that. And, one of those is in 1936, and you think of this in the modern context. Seamus O'Malley was the captain. He went home that night with a friend, the night of the All-Ireland final with a friend, and he was back up. He was a teacher in a school just outside Claremorris. And he brought the Sam Maguire Cup into the school the following morning, tied to the handlebars of his bike. So you can imagine Monday morning, the Sam Maguire arriving to a rural school in Mayo, just outside Claremorris, being brought in by the captain, a teacher. I presume he worked that day too. It seemed he did. So it was stories like that around the All-Ireland finals that we tried to capture, and I think enjoyed most bringing to life, I would say.
Yeah, and they really came across. I had a couple picked out myself. Dermot, for you, what are, I suppose, your favourite pieces that you found out or you discovered along the way?
Well, as a totally biased Kildare man, I could spend an hour talking about the 1928 final. One particularly notable aspect of that was that the Kildare team that was due to line out that day had one change relative to the team that had won the championship in 1927. It transpired that a delegation from the Cavan selection committee arrived into the Kildare dressing room to announce that they were under the impression that one of the Kildare players was illegal, having played in a junior club match in a different county some months previously. The bottom line is that the man in question had to be demoted. The person who he had replaced had broken his ribs in a cycling accident. He was strapped up, given a naggin of whiskey, and sent out to play, and he played a starring role. So Kildare, with precisely the same 15, won the championship, but to some extent under peculiar circumstances. So that was one that strikes me. Even if I can jump forward a fair bit, much more recent in relative terms, we're all familiar now with teams and players arriving out with all manner and means of jerseys and tracksuits and tops, etc. But when Cork won the All-Ireland back in 1973, as they prepared for the game in the Skylon Hotel that morning, the man in charge of the jerseys discovered that one of the jerseys was missing. Eventually, it dawned on all and sundry that as part of a promotional activity with Cleary's department store on O'Connell Street, some of the match paraphernalia was in Cleary's window, including one of the Cork jerseys. And using a police escort and getting security companies up and out, the jersey was retrieved, put on the back of a 19-year-old Jimmy Barry Murphy, who after 3 minutes had the ball in the net, and he doubled that 10 minutes later. So going from having potentially no jersey at all, Jimmy Barry Murphy, JBM, as we all know him, played a starring role in Cork winning that championship. But the thoughts that might happen nowadays, for me, for someone as old as me, I could say, well, it's only 50 years ago, but it is 50 years ago, but things have changed.
They absolutely have, yeah. Sorry, go on.
I should really also mention, I mentioned 1952 in the Maguires, but an All-Ireland final that went to New York and was played in the Polo Grounds in 1947. Now, this has been brilliantly captured in a book before by Paul Fitzpatrick with the Fairy Tale in New York, but just documenting that and documenting some of the coverage around it and the transmission of text and photographs back to London and back to Dublin and all of that, and putting it back together. You think of what it took, the logistics of that to bring an All-Ireland final over to New York and even for the teams to get over there, and just documenting all of that, I think is one of the highlights too. Not saying that has been done before and over again, and as I mentioned, has been captured in a book, but it is certainly 1947 is one of the most invigorating chapters too in the book.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was reading that they sent out the delegation beforehand, and to make sure everything was, and it took them longer to get there than it took Neil Armstrong to get to the moon. So that kind of puts it into context, the huge upheaval that had to occur, but for forward thinking as well, and a great promotion for the game. I'm going to throw in my own bias now. I'm going to ask you about Offaly. So obviously I was straight to the 70s when to see how you charted that. Have you gotten, I suppose, similar to me, is that how people are receiving the book? Are they kind of talking about their own counties to you? Do you find that, Dermot?
Well, I'm happy to jump in there. I come from a place called Carbery in Kildare, and I went to school in Eton-Derry.
I was just going to say you were nearly lucky.
I was. And the Offaly people say the same thing. I sat beside Stephen Darby in school for 5 years, and he went on and won All Ireland. I didn't. But as it happens, we had a school reunion before Christmas, or a class reunion. And all of those people from the class, 90% of them, are from Offaly, and thankfully they were all good supporters of me in terms of buying my book and all the rest of it. But they wanted to talk about the Iron Man from Road and Greg Hughes, Tony McTeague, and all the feedback that I'm getting, and I'm pretty sure Colm is the same. Anyone who rings to say anything, they'll all say, "I jumped to 1956. I jumped to 1971," and I think. Offaly, as but Offaly came through in 71, but they had an agonizing few years before that. They only lost by a point in 1961 in front of the biggest crowd ever that ever attended Croke Park. They lost by 3 in 69. Many thought that maybe and indeed after the 69 final, the aforementioned Iron Man announced his retirement from the game, Paddy McCormack.
Yeah.
But 3 years later, he had 2 All-Ireland medals, and he was full back on the All-Star team. But absolutely, you can talk with me, you talk with loud people, they will rhyme off the team from 1957, down people similarly. And I think that's one of the pluses, if you like, that I'd like to think our book brings, is that there's nearly something for everybody, even counties that weren't successful, even counties in terms of winning All Irelands, counties that never got to an All Ireland final. There's something in it for everyone, because when we start to describe what Colm labelled the foothills, if we're talking about a match between Leitrim and Sligo in 1947, depending on the events of the day, it may well get as much coverage as a provincial final, and there's names coming out of that, and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren are alive, but they're getting some sort of recognition or acknowledgement. There would be no championship. We wouldn't have what we have today, but for the contribution that all of those people from all of those counties made.
Yeah, and I had Paddy McCormack on a tour actually when I was a tour guide, and he was so unassuming. Nobody really on the tour knew who he was, because I was very excited. But yeah.
I might just add there, Juliana, about the index at the back of the book.
Yes,
it's 27 pages. When I saw it, I couldn't believe it. When the index was sent to us to check back and to have a look back and to see, well, what could we unearth anything? I actually couldn't believe it was 27 pages for a book like that. The number of names and the number of occasions in it. So go to the back of the book and see, is your father or grandfather included there? Because there's every chance they are. As Dermot mentioned, we went back to the very, very start of every Munster, every Ulster, every Leinster and Connacht championship, and we documented what we could about almost every game. And certainly if there was some element of it that stood out, we certainly captured that, I would assume. So the index is incredible for 27 pages. You can just go to the back and pick a year and delve into it and see, is it relevant to you?
I actually had that written down, the size of the index, and it's also a testament, I suppose, to the huge amount of research then that the two of you had to undertake for each of them names to appear. It's incredible. It's one of the biggest indexes I've seen. It's amazing. Colin, this one's maybe for you. I suppose Dermot mentioned there the counties and the importance to the people. And there's been 16 teams, I think, that have won the Sam, four since the first 50 years. But do you think we can ever add to that now? Will there be new counties to be added to the Sam in the near or distant future, do you think?
I don't think so. I can't see where it's all the teams that have won Sam Maguire, I think will be on repeat business for quite some time. Hard to see where it's going to come from in the short or medium term. In the long term, who knows? Maybe football will take off in Belfast and in Antrim or something like that. But there's such competition there and there's such organisation, such finance behind teams and such movement and then tradition, those 16 counties and more before the Sam Maguire.
Yeah.
But obviously some of those have fallen off since. But I don't think so. I can't see where another All-Ireland final will be won by a county that hasn't previously won. Now, I could be missing out on something obvious here, but I honestly don't think so.
Yeah, we were just chatting about it yesterday too. It is, it's amazing. The teams from the start are still strong. Kerry, obviously, Galway, Mayo.
You look back at the book, and obviously you look back at the path of GAA history, and whatever is thrown at Kerry historically, they have always come up with a response. Whether it was down in the 60s, Dublin in the 70s, Tyrone and Armagh then in the 2000s, they're still probably formulating a response to Dublin's dominance in the last decade. They have got one All-Ireland back. But if you look back at that path in history, even 1955, and we documented it here, and it's a well-known story that Dublin in 1955 came with a new look team that was very much all drawn from native Dublin, city-based, that weren't up from the country, which they usually depended on before that. And in 1955, they crushed Meath in the Leinster final, scored 5 goals against them. Kevin Heffernan brought in tactics, a roving full corner forward, and out he came to the middle. And this was away from the fundamentals of catch and kick, and upset a lot of people that the game was being played that way. And history is a habit of repeating itself, of course. But it was generally contended that Dublin had brought a new way of playing football that was going to cast everybody aside. And they beat Mayo actually after a replay, I think in 1955 they beat. But Dublin were warm favourites in the 1955 All-Ireland final against Kerry. And Kerry won that game well. And it was seen as a victory for the old ways as opposed to the new ways. And Kerry had come up with another solution again. And that repeated. They eventually got to grips with the Down challenge. It took them to the late 60s. They won 2 All-Irelands in 69 and 70 after Down had won their third. So they generally always come up with a response. And as I said, they're still formulating the current response.
Yeah, you can track kind of the changes in football. There's a lot of talk of the hand pass as well, and there was changing rules in the first 50 years of that, which I thought was really interesting. And also there was a lot of draws and replays in finals. Dermot, did you realise that before you went about your research?
Well, I would have been conscious of the fact that Kerry were in the habit, when they got to a replay, they were virtually unbeatable. And they had established that record. In relative terms, there probably have been more replays in recent times. And certainly, if you go back to the era in which we write, there was a replay for 1972. And in fact, Offaly had an outstanding win against Kerry in the 72 replay. But you had to go back to the 50s before there was previously a draw in the final, back 20 years earlier. There were replays in 37 and 38, quite unusual. Now, we had a little bit of that in the last 10 years or so between the hurling and the football.
Yeah.
But It is interesting, and it may be going a little bit off-piste in saying this, but I know the rule is different for finals, but whether it was semi-finals, provincial finals, or any other match, some of the greatest drama that we've had in the history of the game has come from replays and the anticipation of replays and the build-up to replays. And when you look at a match like Donegal and Armagh the other day, and there's been a lot said and spoken about the penalty shootout and all the rest of it. Well, whatever other factors kick into play, if that match was being replayed next week, wherever, you'd have a full house. You'd probably have a great match, but not necessarily so. But it was, a lot of the time, the replays added so much to the fabric and to the interest and the talking points around the game. So I would say historically, and not just in finals, the build-up to a replay was a big, big deal. And we've a couple of occasions. While we're on the subject, back in '91, we had Dublin and Meath playing 4 times. We had something similar back in 1941. I think it was Wexford and Carlow. But there was one
which I
time
didn't realise, actually. I only read that the other day when I was going through the book.
Well, back in 1926, I think it was Sligo and Leitrim, if I'm not mistaken. They played 6 times before they finally got.
Wow. That's definitely not going to happen ever again. 6 replays. I can't see it.
It's currently the All Ireland final is the only game that can go to a replay. Everything else is decided by extra time and penalties. But if an All Ireland final replay goes to extra time, it will then be decided on penalties. So,
wow, can you imagine the pressure? Wow. I have a couple of more things, and I know I'm conscious. I said let's stick to the time. One is, Colm, I want to ask about the gate receipts. I thought in the stats section in each, I noticed the gate receipts. Where did you find the information for that? And I suppose, how significant is it as a stat? Is it interesting to analyse?
Well,
it went up and down a bit. You could
it
see.
did, and they weren't always available, but the gate receipts were always carried in the paper the following day. So
okay.
they were always put out there in public. How significant are they? Well, it just captures, I suppose, a moment in time that this is how much is generated from an All Ireland final. I find it interesting that they did actually put it out there and made it public knowledge, because it's not something that is public knowledge today, specifically around the game. Obviously, attendances will be, but the actual revenues from games aren't. But back then, yes, it was a feature. And also, who threw in the ball? That was always a big deal as well.
Yeah, I saw there was a bishop from Zanzibar one year, which was very interesting. I think that appeared somewhere, but yeah, and the photos with the bishop are very interesting, like of old Ireland, I suppose. It's probably for people today that seems like a totally different world.
That went by the wayside in the 60s, Dermot, wasn't
it? 65 or 66, I think.
Yeah.
Archbishop Morris was probably, well, he was, because I can remember the last bishop to throw the ball in back in the mid-60s. It probably became dangerous then. Bishops.
Julianne, you mentioned.
Just for a second. No, Julianne, when you were speaking there about attendances, I suppose the motivation for putting in the takings was to sort to give somebody a chance to work out. But what was the average admission price to get in? Now, the figures wouldn't make much sense now when you consider premiums and all the rest of it. But one thing that sticks out from that, the attendance at the Polo Ground final in 47 was a little bit less than might have been expected, because the weather conditions on the morning of the game were terrible. But based on the exchange rate with the dollar, etc., at the time, the takings would have been a very, very significant multiple of what they would have been in Ireland at the Matchbook Park. Yeah, huge multiple.
So the tickets were more expensive?
Well, the tickets were appropriate for the New York audience, but $1 or something like that. So yeah, it was way out of kilter, and the takings that day. It would have been decades later before it was surpassed.
Wow. Sorry, Colm, you were mentioning.
Yeah, I was only mentioning rule changes. Rule changes came in, intermittently during but one of the most significant ones, I think, it was in 1945. Prior to that, you threw in a sideline, and it was only at the beginning of the 1945 championship that players started to kick the ball in from the sideline, which was off the ground, and that changed again then in the early 1990s when it was out of the hand. It became out of the hand, but before that, that ball was thrown back in by one of the match officials.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that. That's mad. Yeah, the real changes are interesting. I'm going to my last question, I suppose, is, and Dermot, you've probably got it about 3 million times. Will there be a part 2? Are you working to the next 50 years now? Or are you going to enjoy your retirement? Or is it both?
Well, for those people who have enjoyed what they've seen so far, they'll be glad to hear, yes, there'll be a part 2. For those people who don't really think much of the project, they might be surprised to hear there might in fact be a part 3, but that one is under wraps at the moment. But wow, yeah, we expect to have a couple of more books within the next 3-4 years.
We actually at the outset we intended bringing this project up to the modern day, but the volume of information and the way we set about it became so vast that a decision was taken to split it in half from 1928 to 1977, and then go the next 50 years and try and align it with the 100 years of the presentation of the Sam Maguire for the All-Ireland champions. And that's what we intend to do, whether it's the 100th presentation or just 100 years, whether it's 1927 or 1928, that just depends on what way you look at it. Is 100 years of Sam or the 100th year? That's the distinction, really. But work is underway. I mean, some of the chapters have already been researched and put together on that. Wow. So work hopefully is underway. It will take a few years, obviously, to bring it all together. And it will be easier to track the teams because transfers and movement is a lot less now.
Yes.
And myself and Dermot have lived through quite a bit of it. So we should be able to, even by memory, we'll have a good chance of being able to track them down before we even started the research. So that movement isn't as great now. Obviously, with better transport, even greater commitment to place and area, I think it'd be more straightforward.
Oh, it's amazing. That's a great idea to tie it in with 100 years as well. So we really look forward to that. I have a million questions that I didn't even get to. There was one thing before I finish that I found out that was nearly my favorite thing in the whole book. Where is it? And it's just an aside, and it kind of, I think, sums up the quirky facts and everything that are in the book. Acknowledging the county's designation as the Onion County, many of Carlow's fervid supporters were seen sporting scallions for colours on the day of their Leinster final clash with Dublin. Isn't that amazing? 1944. So if anyone enjoyed those tidbits, I think it's brilliant. And it's a real book you can kind of pick up and put down. You don't necessarily have to read it in chronological order. And a great gift as well for people, even not necessarily interested in Gaelic games or sport, but as I said, as a social history. So you certainly, overachieved in your ambitions, I'm sure, from when you started, and it's become this now. We might take this up again, even in the museum sometime. I'd love to do another event because it's brilliant. But thank you both so much for taking the time. Especially Colm, I know you're super busy, so I really appreciate it. And Dermot, thank you so much for getting in touch and being such a great advocate for the museum and using the images from us as well. And you're both welcome to visit us anytime. I'm just going to leave it there with a big thank you.
Thank you very much for having us, Julian. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.